Hello, my name's Ria Bales and I'm the Managing Director of Bales Partners Consulting. And today I am joined by Sukh Pabial, who is the Senior Learning Strategist from Challenging Frontiers. So thank you so much for joining me, Sukh.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Ria.
Great. We're going to talk about culture today, aren't we? Just a quick chat and a coffee about culture. And I think maybe to kick that off, one of the first things that strikes me about culture is it's just so difficult to describe, to be able to articulate. And to me, I guess it feels a bit like sand falling through your hands, isn't it? Is that it's difficult to describe the shape of it and kind of all sorts around that. And maybe one of the things I'd observe around culture is that, how many times do you see companies treat it like a project? They're going to install a system of something, treat it as a project, and then they kind of move on and forget about it. And that doesn't feel as though that's kind of the way that we should be treating culture. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we hear leaders and HR, L&D talk about culture, because it can sometimes be this catch-all. This is a culture. This is how we do things around here. This is how we all talk to each other, operate, or what have you. But often they mean very, very clearly they know what they're talking about. So either it's about the leadership and how are the leaders presenting themselves, how are they managing a team, what are they doing in that space, or it's around the operations. It's the the doing. Like, this is our expectations. These are the behaviors that we expect to see people living up to, or it's around the values and how they're manifest. So it can mean so many different things. And if I'm going to take your sand analogy a bit further, right? It's you can craft sand if you add water to it and you create sand castles and you create structures out of it, and it can. But I think then where it's interesting is that sometimes that needs to change completely. So you dry it out, you smooth it out, and you say, okay, let's just start from a blank canvas. Actually, what does it look like if we were to, if we didn't have this practice in place and we wanted something different, what would that look like? And how do we move from point A to point B in that case?
Yeah. And there's a good point, I think, there, so isn't there? Because moving from point A to point B with culture, I think quite often we can really focus on the business case. So what do we want culture to do for the business? But we don't necessarily think about kind of the psychological case for it. And what we're dealing with is actually people's worlds. It's their way that they're doing things. It's their life. It's their worlds about how they work. And changing that is bound to trip over into that bit, I think, around trust, isn't it?
Absolutely, it does. And I'm going to stick with the analogy a bit more because as I'm just kind of working it through, it's holding a bit for some reason. So if we imagine that everyone's created their own sandcastle in their own way, and then we're coming along and saying, I can see what you've done and I see how it works for you, but actually we need it to look like this thing over here. That's a really big thing for people to be able to, but I've created this thing. I think you're absolutely right. That psychological investment into, well, people have done what they've done for a long time. They're probably being supported with that, and then to be able to say, okay, now we need to go to somewhere else. That's a real shift. It's a real shift for a lot of people, and we know change is uncomfortable for many different reasons. It's an interesting one to just kind of really make sure we pay attention to.
I quite like the quote that talks about that your company's culture is only going to reflect kind of the worst of the behaviours that you're prepared to tolerate. It's a little bit like that your team can only go as fast as the slowest person within the team. Culture, from my perspective, I think culture is about working every single day. Culture is hard every single day on making sure that we keep just establishing what is the norm that we want around here. What fits our organisation the best.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe tell me a bit of some of your thoughts around that kind of the reward and sanction kind of bit that would support culture.
I kind of fall down more on the side of everyday conversations. If our everyday conversations reinforce the behaviors that we're looking for, and that helps people to know, we're working towards this goal, and I've seen you guys as a team pull together, and this is what you're doing really well. That's really empowering. It really helps the team to know that they are on track, they're doing the things that they need to do. Where that they where that you see bad behavior going, people getting away with it without anything, any repercussions or any circumstances out of it. That's where those everyday conversations need to, I think, step in, right? You need to be able to, leaders or team members need to be able to step in and go, whoa, hold on, the way that just happened, that wasn't right. We need to have, but that it requires a fair bit of trust. You talked about trust a bit earlier. We have to have that trust that it's okay to do that. I can have this conversation without it being detrimental to either me or the team, and those the rewards or the sanctions that are in place support the right kinds of behaviors. And if we see bad kinds of behaviors, that we need to be able to call them out. Sometimes it does just require a clear, firm conversation. That happened, don't do that again.
What you've described there, I completely agree, is that it takes all levels, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it takes, leaders to role model, it takes next level down, it takes absolutely all levels of kind of the structure in your organisations to be on board with, we buy into what our culture is, and we all actively just keep it alive, almost kind of every day. One of the things that I see quite typically where this really, really falls down, I think, is when a leader, somebody towards the top of the organisation, has got a really difficult decision. Mm-hmm. We've all had that, have really got to implement something that is difficult for their people. And I guess times like that means that there is almost more, there's much more focus on trust that is needed, but it's uncomfortable. It's difficult. It's awkward. And in actual fact, you see that leader step away from some of the values, some of the culture that we've kind of that is accepted and it's talked about. They maybe start, their communication is less effective.
Yeah.
They close up. They step back from being engaged with and I think leaders sometimes just don't recognise the damage that can do. And it's not in the moment. Well, it is in the moment, but it's also the kind of the longer term damage that can do, because why should I buy into this kind of this system, this way of working, this kind of collective living thing that we have all kind of signed up to, if actually somebody over here is not demonstrating it or allowed to get away with it? It's tough.
It really is. And I think that there's been a lot of work in the last, I'm going to say like decade or so, where we've really started to pay attention to what does the research tell us in this space as well, right? Around what do good modern leaders do with their authenticity, how they show up to the world. If they're, there's been some really interesting examples, I think, in social media in recent times when we've heard that there's CEOs of top companies who've decided to step away because their mental health is being impacted. That's a really good positive example of how a senior leader has been able to front up and say, I can't continue to lead the business anymore because of the impact it's having on me. Whereas we see too many cases where people feel that that's a vulnerability and it's too weak and I can't show that. They act in other ways which end up being more harmful.
And we've talked a fair bit, so I think, haven't we, about kind of the leader's role in culture. But actually, I think everybody has a role, don't they, in kind of establishing that culture. And I think the kind of the shared understanding of what it is. And I completely agree with the point that you made, is that quite often you see it from board level all the way through, is that someone will label, we need to do something about the culture, or the culture needs to reflect this. And I think that's not always particularly helpful, because it's much more helpful to be really pinpoint precise on what exactly is it that we need to change, why, what is it that we're attempting to achieve through that. And I think everybody has that role, don't they, of establishing that, building that, growing it, keeping it, maintaining it, because I guess that's the kind of social cohesion that kind of pulls us all together, isn't it? We've all learned through COVID, and so many of us having to work remotely. It is certainly bringing, I think, questions to actually, how do we actively work on keeping that cohesion together? We're not organisations that are made up of however many tens, hundreds, thousands of individual employees. We all should be acting together as one. That's really important, isn't it?
Oh, it's I think it's vital. The cohesion piece is, I think that's one of the things that's been most negatively impacted throughout this whole lockdown experience. And but actually, the tech is enabling us to do it really well. Where I think that everyone can do better is by paying attention to how can you use platforms like Teams or other platforms to be able to have that sense of camaraderie, that sense of we're in this together, that I'm not just at home by myself. I actually have a team that I can reach out to. Those things are vital. And in when it comes to the development of that culture piece, I think it's allowing the teams themselves to also provide that direction themselves. Like, they're the ones doing the doing, right? They know what the day-to-day operations are, and as long as they have a clear vision of, well, this is where we're at and this is where we'd like to get to, how can we as a collective get to that point? I think that's always a strong place to come from, because then you have everyone's buy-in, as opposed to a leader, and this is how it used to be done, right? Is the leaders who say, this is where we're going to get to, and here's the plan, and you just need to get on board with it. Like, well, what if I'm not on board with it? Then what happens?
Absolutely, and you're storing up, and you're just building problems that are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, don't you? It's been so fun talking to you about culture, because it's such a big topic, isn't it? I think maybe some of the takeaways for me, some of the tips maybe from our conversation is leaders thinking really, really hard about how they act and how they kind of behave. And I guess the perception of, people are always looking at leaders. So thinking at it perhaps through that lens, isn't it? Maybe thinking hard about the unintentional consequences of things that you put in place as well. And there's been quite a few companies that have put in place, either reward structures, for example, and then realise the unintended consequences of that actually are quite negative, aren't they? Something around certainly being really clear about what it is that you want from your culture.
Yes.
And what it is that you mean around that. And then lastly, for me, it is, culture is hard work, and that we have to work on it every single day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sukh. It's been lovely speaking to you.